Hey everybody, you're listening to the BTW Media Podcast, the show that explores the stories, innovations, and insights for people who love technology and the internet. In this episode, Michael Richardson and I will at RIPE89 discussing the current state of IoT security, its challenges, and potential solutions. Hello everyone, welcome back to BTW Media. I'm Faye in RIPE89. In this section, we'll have a conversation with Michael Richardson. Hi Michael, nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Michael Richardson. I'm a Canadian working on IoT standards in the security area. And I write a lot of IETF RFCs, and ideally, I get to implement them as well.
That's good. By the way, how many times have you attended RIPE conference?
I believe this is my third or fourth time in person, and I mostly have remote attended, 6 or 7.
Wow, lucky me to have you here. So, based on your background, here I prepared 3 questions. Are you ready? Okay, so the first one is, the security update mechanism for IoT devices have been the weak point, with many devices still lacking basic security update capabilities. And what effective measures do you believe could reduce security problem in these devices?
Well, the first thing is that we have a couple of device update standards. One of them coming from the IETF is called SUIT, Software Update for Internet of Things. And I think that the availability of a standard will mean that CPU manufacturers, who often wind up producing the fundamental boot blocks, the booting system that enables the rest of the device to work, will include things like a SUIT parser to be able to do automatic updates. So in the future, newer devices will find it much, much easier to do software updates, and it'll be much more reliable. The often problem with software updates is that users and manufacturers are anxious about, well, is the device going to work correctly afterwards? And the other thing that people are anxious about is, will it retain my settings? After I do the update, will I have to reconfigure it again? It was hard enough to configure the first time. And so I think there's a quality of implementation that's going on. But then the other side of this is a number of jurisdictions, the UK is the first one in terms of implementing it, have mandated that updates be available for a clear amount of time. That went into effect April of this year. So the directive is 2 years old and it took effect April 1 this year. So in theory, devices will not be importable to the UK unless they actually have a promise of updates over time. Okay. California has a similar policy. It's unclear to me when it will actually be mandated. It's part of the U.S. executive directive from 2021. So basically, a significant part of the market will basically be saying no updates, no sale. And I think that part and potential for fines under EU, it tends to be fines. In the United States, it tends to be regulatory punishments.
Is something to do with the policy maker?
The policymakers. And so I mean, this is a real problem. So what that probably means for all the devices that people have purchased is it probably means they're all going in the garbage.
Definitely.
Right? And they'll all have to be replaced because, unfortunately, probably the ones that are out in the field are not updatable. And because they're not updatable, they're not fixable, and they're going to go in the garbage. And that's a lot of e-waste, and that's really unfortunate. But overall, we'll be in a better place afterwards.
So what about the use of blockchain to firmware integrity?
So most of the protocols, most of the systems have some kind of a signature, digital signature in the device. There's a fair bit of back and forth between what we call secure boot, which means the device will not boot unless the firmware is signed. But that interacts really poorly with, for instance, the right to repair. So if you can't repair the device, then you can't keep it running in the long term. And so there are other mechanisms. So for instance, instead of secure boot, you can do what's called measured boot. Measured boot. So that basically means that measure what the firmware looks like in the same way that you might check the signature, but you don't check the signature. What you do is you report to the network that I have measured this device and this is the firmware that I have found on it. And then the network says, according to the information I have, you're running the latest firmware, go ahead. Or you're not running the latest firmware, or you're not running the authorized firmware, so I'm going to quarantine you, and you will not be on the network anymore, and you will not be functional until you run the right firmware.
Is that a wise solution? I don't see that.
Well, so one advantage is the device potentially continues to operate.
Yes, definitely, but as for the quality of that experience?
It depends, like what is the device doing? Is it a refrigerator? It probably still operates as a refrigerator, okay? It's just running the old firmware. It can no longer talk to your grocery store and order new groceries, but it can still keep them cold.
Yes.
Okay, and that's the important thing. It doesn't become a brick. It doesn't stop functioning. It still can function there. And If it turns out that actually the company's gone out of business and it really can't safely do internet anyway at that point, but it can still keep your food cold, then the refrigerator still operates as a refrigerator. It's just not as smart as it used to be. And it could be that somebody else comes along and produces firmware that does make it work, and then the network can decide, oh, actually, this other firmware from this alternate provider would be acceptable and will continue. Okay. So that opens up the right to repair while still keeping all the devices safe. Okay.
It's also in the process now.
Yeah, so this is sort of a choice the manufacturers have to make, and we'll see how that works out. But remote attestation, which is what I'm talking about, is essentially what enables that. And we have some specs that allow this and a fair bit of industry push to insist that we do remote attestation and doing it in some ways easier with measured boot rather than secure boot.
Yes, it matters because it's related to our daily lives.
Daily lives, yeah. There will be devices that will continue to be secure boot, and when the manufacturer goes out of business or obsoletes them, we will have to throw them out. And that's just how it works today. And unfortunately, that's not a good thing. But there are some devices that make sense. I mean, if you have, for instance, a glucose meter and you put in your arm, okay, after 10 days, it stops working and you have to get a new one. That's it. Right? So that one gets thrown out and it stops working because it runs out of chemicals to do the sensing. And so you have to renew that anyway. And so what's happened with the major vendors is there's 2 or 3 of them out there. They just, when they're out of chemicals and the electronics die too, right? And you throw them out.
Okay, so the second question for you. In the process of standardizing IoT devices, what specific protocol or technology do you think currently have significant security issues that need to be addressed? And how do you think the priority for this update be determined?
I would say the major problem with most devices is the monetization of the personal information. So the things they collect and who they report to. So the issue is not that the maker of your refrigerator set out to monetize the contents of your refrigerator. That wasn't what they started. What they dealt with the issue is, how do I create a recurring source of revenue so that I can do those security updates that keep them safe? So the irony is that in order to get the security updates, we have these violations of privacy, which piss people off more, okay? But also it means that the device is now communicating a lot more than it needs to, because now it has to report regularly back to headquarters, what's in your refrigerator or something like this. And that's an example. But the other example is lots of cars that are spying on everyone.
Yes.
And there was no reason for, cars 15 years ago were apparently profitable. But they didn't need to do that. So why did this change? What were the economics that changed that? And so I think that there's a certain rush to do this, put all these extra misfeatures in. And I think that most of the security bugs wind up in the misfeature. So from a broader society question, we have to figure out, are we willing to pay a subscription price to keep our car safe, our firmware safe, or do we want surveillance capitalism to pay for that? Because the cost of the surveillance capitalism isn't just the privacy violations. It's the software that goes to collect all that information is often where the security problems are. So it's like a self-fulfilling thing. Oh, there are security bugs, and to pay for them, we have to ship more security bugs. Meanwhile, that also means that there's a desire to lock those devices down so that nobody else can fix them, right?
Really?
So, because if someone is able to go and change the software in their car, that means they could turn off the surveillance, and that would cause the manufacturer to lose money. So there's a whole bunch of process where now the owner of the device is an adversary of the device. So now suddenly the owner doesn't have an interest in keeping their device safe. They want to break into it to turn off the features they don't like. So now the manufacturer and the owner are at odds to each other. Okay. And so now that opens up a whole bunch of things. People say, oh, okay, so if you do this patch, right, I don't know, there's some sequence of buttons that you press and it crashes the system, but that lets you load your own firmware in, right? Some kind of a jailbreak or something process. Well, the consumer is not incentivized to fix that because that's the thing they're using to take ownership of their device. So the biggest problem in my mind is that we don't actually own our devices. Okay? If we owned our devices...
I can use this vehicle, but I can repair them.
Yes, exactly. So if the owner of the devices truly owns it and controls them, then their incentive is aligned with the manufacturer for making them secure. If there's surveillance, then the two of them are in fact opposed. And so that's the biggest, broader problem with design. Now, there's all sorts of other, low-level, issues like, people want to use the cheapest microcontroller possible,
Wow.
and it doesn't support enough crypto. And that was the argument 10 to 15 years ago for why we couldn't do it securely, because the devices were too slow and too expensive. And that's mostly not true anymore. Okay, the majority of the microcontrollers out there can support crypto. The question is, do the majority of the programmers writing code for them understand that? And so that's going to be it. Probably not. Exactly. So they're still thinking, oh, it's an expensive thing and I can't add this, or it's complicated, or this kind of stuff, or they just don't know how to do it. So, we have a lot of different devices and manufacturers and suppliers, and there's probably going to be some kind of shakeout in the industry where a bunch of vendors will just either go to business or they'll just decide this isn't worth my while, it's not profitable as much as it was. And what will be left, I hope, will be a higher quality of device. Okay? But consumers, we have to decide if we're willing to pay a subscription cost or a higher initial price with a potential of a limited lifespan, right? So, you probably have reported on the heated seats problem, right? And people would not have been upset if on day one they'd been told the heated seats is a subscription. Oh, that's okay. I can buy it or not buy it. Or they could be told you can buy it a subscription or you can pay an extra $1,000 up front. I can make that decision. It's an economic decision. Or maybe I don't want heated seats.
Just like a Porsche, right? Where you buy the Porsche.
Yeah, exactly. So what do I want? But the problem was not so much that they had a subscription model. The problem was that they switched to a subscription model by fiat, and people didn't have any choice, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I can modify it after that.
Right. So, it's neat that they only had one assembly line. All their seats had heaters in them. They just didn't turn them on. And that's acceptable to me. And people find it weird, but it goes back to like the 1950s. IBM had single speed and double speed printers. And the price difference was 3 times between one and the other. But they would sell you the single speed printer, and then people would realize, oh, everyone's waiting around for printouts, right? We're talking about, printers that are the size of small couches, right, at the time. And you said, oh, yeah, I'll pay the money to get an upgrade. And the IBM service person would come and remove a gear. So there was an extra gear that made it slower.
Wow.
Okay, so it really was a double speed printer. And they put an extra gear in there so that the motor would run half a speed. Well, that's a single speed printer.
Okay.
And they would sell it at a loss to people because they would get their printer loaded, purchased. And then they would go, oh, we really did want the double speed. Okay. And so they would remove the gear and then it would go faster. And that's exactly the same thing as the heated seats. All of them are heated. But if you turned it on or off, that was a software issue. It's just now not a physical gear that you remove, it's a software setting. And I don't know if you could opt into heated seats after you purchase the car. Maybe. I don't know. I've never bought that car. But the point is that it's not a new thing to do this. It's been around for a long, long time. It's just we're not always aware that this is happening, right? We just, okay.
Just like me, I never heard this before.
Yeah.
It's totally brand new to me.
Yeah. It's out there. Just people don't always know what's happening. I think there are TVs that are 1080p TVs, but are also sold as 720p TVs. So 1080p, but there may also be sold as lower resolution TVs.
Yes.
And it's just a software change.
Probably the 720.
Yeah, 720. And it's just like, okay, if you pay less money, but we're not going to have 2 manufacturing lines. We're going to produce the same thing. Or we used to, for instance, you go out and buy a 1 terabyte hard drive for $100. Okay. And a 3 terabyte hard drive for $200. Well, they're all 3 terabyte hard drives. It's just the 1 terabyte hard drive is a 3 terabyte hard drive where half the hard drive is not working, right? When they tested it, it wasn't perfectly manufactured.
Definitely.
And so they said, okay, we just mark half or 1/3 of the hard drive as unusable, and we sell it as a 1 terabyte hard drive. Same thing happens with the Intel CPUs. You buy a 3 gigahertz CPU. That's the ones that tested at 3 gigahertz. And the 2 gigahertz CPUs, well, they wouldn't run at 3 gigahertz. They had manufacturing issues.
What's the meaning of that?
But they would run at 2. So you buy it at 2 and you pay less money. Otherwise, Intel or AMD what are they going to do? They're going to throw away the ones that don't work, right? But they do work, they just work slower. So they sell them for less money. So we've always been doing that. We manufacture things and then we put them into different bins as to how well they tested.
Okay. I don't see any meaning of that.
You don't see it because it's in a different box. Well, we do this with people even, right? You know, you're good enough to go to this school and this person's didn't test as well. They go to a lesser school and this person doesn't go to school at all, right? We do that as well. I mean, it has to do with testing. You know, with people, you can improve people and there's other considerations. But the point is that in manufacturing for a long, long time, we've done this thing. It's a sensible economic process. Not everyone needs a 3 gigahertz processor.
Is that practical?
Yeah, it's practical.
Really?
I mean, people they have to test every component.
But just for this one purpose, for test?
Yeah, well, they have to test them all. Otherwise, they will be shipping it stuff that doesn't work. So they have to put through a quality assurance process, and the quality assurance process will tell them how fast it can run. And if it doesn't run at the fastest speed, then they sell it as a slower speed part.
Yes.
Which is why, for instance, you can usually overclock your CPU. You buy a 2 gigahertz CPU, and maybe you can make it run at 2.4 with a 2.4 gigahertz,
Yes.
a bit faster. But maybe it's not as reliable at that speed.
Okay.
But, you're like, but I'm a gamer and I just want the right thing. And if my computer gets too hot and it stops working, that's okay. I'll just stop it and restart it. That's okay for gaming, maybe.
Yes.
But not okay for a web server. I mean, a web server, you might say, it's a 2 gigahertz CPU, but I'm going to run it at 1.5 because I want it extra reliable. Right? You could even make that decision the other way around. You could underclock it, uses less energy, produces less heat, lasts longer. That's sort of the same way as you might not always drive your Porsche at 300 kilometers an hour, right?
Yes.
Right? You often drive it slower because it uses less gas. It's the same kind of decision there. But as I said, in IoT space, that I think the biggest problem is that we have to decide whether or not we are willing to pay for security.
We need to take the right in our own hands.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. And let's move on to the third question. Although RPKI is being promoted globally, some regions do have a lower adoption rate. Do you believe that the deployment of RPKI in the IoT sector could help improve security? And if so, what obstacle do you think are hindering this adoption?
Yeah. So one of the things that's hindering it is lawyers. So in the ARIN region, before you can do RPKI, you have to sign certain agreements with ARIN to get the trust anchors so that you can validate things.
Okay.
That's the result of basically U.S. lawyers saying, we don't want to be responsible for you screwing up unless you indemnify us. In the RIPE region, the trust anchors are just available. Anyway, you run it, you turn it on, you experiment with it, you don't experiment with it, whatever. Okay? So that's one of the things. So I run a small data center in Ottawa. I don't run RPKI. Well, I have the expertise. I don't have the time. I'm not quite sure if I want to sign that agreement. That will require that I hire a lawyer and to advise me. So that's an impediment for me just experimenting with it. The second thing that I think is happening is that in the ARIN region, there are fewer ISPs. They're more incumbent, more dominant. And RPKI is about trust between ISPs. It's improving the trust. So if there are fewer actors in that market, then there are fewer people to trust. So it's easier to form the trust there. In the RIPE region, for instance, there's a lot more countries involved. There's a lot more national ISPs, a lot more R&E networks. There's a lot more ISPs, period. So there's just many, many more entities. And so RPKI is much more valuable in terms of establishing trust among a larger group of strangers. So that's my impression. That's why I think is taking on more easy to do in the RIPE region than in the ARIN region. I can't comment about the Asia Pacific region. I believe it's probably the lowest adoption of RPKI. That would be my guess. But I suspect that has more to do with lack of training, lack of experience, and anxiety about whether we even need this, right? So I think it's a really kind of valuable thing in general. It helps BGP hijacking. It helps defeat BGP hijacking. However, there are a number of attacks that it does not prevent at this point, and those attacks are hard to deal with. We don't have specifications that deal with them at all. So RPKI is a good first step, but for some entities, it's like, yeah, it's a good first step, but it's not really, doesn't really have the return on investment unless we can also do the other ones.
Yes.
Okay. So I also think that there is a lack of kind of government supervision, particularly, I will say in Canada. Do I think that my Canadian security intelligence thing who deal with cyber threats, do they understand what RPKI is? Not really sure.
Not really.
Not really sure. Do I think the UK NCSC does? Yes, I think they know it. Okay, so I think there's a lot more senior level kind of thing. I think there's many more banking executives that understand what RPKI is in Europe. In Canada, we can't even get the banking people to fix their firewalls. And the policies and what the government tells some of these people is relevant to them.
Yes.
And I don't think that message is getting through there in North America.
RPKI is not really prevail in the world, actually.
No, I'm involved in an IX and we do validation. We run the RPKI. I was involved in setting some of that up. As I said, I have some of the expertise, but I don't have the time to set it up for myself.
Okay.
But also in my network, right now I have one transit peer only. That's a bug. Okay. But it also means that there's only one place for me to announce to.
Yes.
And I know that the place I announce to is not validating RPKI.
Yeah.
So there's no advantage to me to setting it all up because my one transit peer is not going to validate it anyway, right? So there's I could get to it next week, So it's something I'd like to do, okay, but it's not clear that's the highest priority problem I have, all right? And I think that's the big deal. For many, many entities, they just have more important things that they have to deal with and things that take them in other directions and that kind of stuff.
Wow, really good. So let me give a really briefly summary. The security update problem for IoT devices can be tackled through the combination of the technology solution like OTA updates, right?
Yes,
And
suit
also the security boot.
Yes.
That suit.
Yeah.
And also the regulatory measure like the minimum support period or mandate update capabilities, right?
In the UK, okay, what is their law called? I can't remember. But there's a UK law, came into effect April 1, that mandates that you will support updates.
Oh, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see how that plays out in terms of when will they first find somebody, right? We'll see what that happens.
Yeah, we'll see.
And what the reaction is to the executives, right?
And also the user education.
I think that's important. I think users expect updates. They've come to understand that it's important, but they're also anxious about them, as I said before.
Yeah, sure. And a multi-facet approach involving manufacturers, just like you said, and policymakers and consumer will be necessary to effectively reduce security vulnerability in IoT devices. Okay, really thank you to have you here and give us really brilliant concept to us. If you have more concept to share with us, just contact me and I hope to see you in the next conference. Probably the RIPE90 or IETF, right?
I'll be remote.
Remote?
I'll be remote for that one. Yeah, it'll be in May and I will not be traveling.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, really nice to see you. Thank you. Thanks for joining us for another episode.